Yay! There we go. Hello to my viewer from Waterworld. Oh, God. Oh, howdy. Many viewers from Waterworld. Yay! We've got lots of atmospheric rushing water, I'm sure. God, I've been seeing some wild videos from everyone. So I'm a bit late. Hey! Hello! You're caught up. Alright. Oh, Jesus. I hope that's a joke, but I also think it's not. Oh, yo. Don't drive in floodwater. That's all I have to say. That's where all of the fatalities are happening. It's in the floodwater. Okay, good. Look, honestly. It's a very Titanic vibe for that to be happening. Like the string quartet on the Titanic as it goes down. Look, who am I to judge? If that's how you want to spend your time, the rain has stopped, the floods have not receded. Yeah, exactly. Let's do that as a Brisbane stream. Okay. Should we read some book? Let's read some book. So last time, because I know that some of you were not here, is the inquest going on the dead actress, Dorian Gray's former lover and fiance. Well, fiance and kisser, I guess. And it's very sad at having to know that that's happening, not at the fact that she's dead. Lord Henry has sent him a book, which I think is the book that Lord Henry earlier said had changed his life forever when he read it as a teen. So I assume it's both very horny and very, amoral, very nihilistic. And like all of Lord Henry's influences on Dorian is completely enraptured by it. So where we left off was, it was almost 9 o'clock before he reached the club, where he found Lord Henry sitting alone in the morning room, looking very much bored. "I'm so sorry, Harry," he cried, "but it really is entirely your fault. The book you sent me so fascinated me that I forgot how the time was going." "Yes, I thought you would like it," replied his host, rising from his chair. "I didn't say I liked it, Harry. I said it fascinated me. There is a great difference." "Ah, you have discovered that?" murmured Lord Henry, and they passed into the dining room. So, Chapter 11. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. Oh, actually, I've just realized it's a bit small on there. I'll make it a bit bigger. There we go. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought to free himself from it. He procured from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition, and had them bound in different colours, so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. The hero, the young Parisian in whom the romantic and scientific temperaments were so strangely blended, became to him a kind of prefiguring type of himself. And indeed, the whole book seemed to him to contain the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. God. What a cunt. just, what's the word I'm looking for? It's pretentious ass. I don't know. Anyway. At one point, he was more fortunate than the novel's fantastic hero. He never knew, never indeed had any cause to know, that somewhat grotesque dread... In one point, he was more fortunate than the novel's fantastic hero. He never knew, never indeed had any cause to know, that somewhat grotesque dread of mirrors and polished metal surfaces and still water which came upon the young Parisian so early in his life, and was occasioned by the sudden decay of a beau that had once, apparently, been so remarkable. It was with an almost cruel joy, and perhaps in nearly every joy, as certainly in every pleasure, cruelty had its place, that he used to read the latter part of the book, with its really tragic, if somewhat overemphasized account of the sorrow and despair of one who had lost what in others and the world he had most dearly valued. For the wonderful beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward, and many others besides him, seemed never to leave him. Even those who had heard the most evil things against him, and from time to time strange rumours about his mode of life crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs. He could not believe anything to his dishonour when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. Men who talked grossly became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. There was something in the purity of his face that rebuked them. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the memory of innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. Often, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such conjecture among those who were his friends, or thought that they were so, he himself would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door with the key that never left him now, and stand with a mirror in front of the portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him, looking now at the evil and aging face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. The very sharpness of the contrast used to quicken his sense of pleasure. He grew more and more enamoured with his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared the wrinkling forehead or crawled around the heavy, sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. He would place his white hand beside the coarse, bloated hands of the picture and smile. He mocked the misshapen body and the failing limbs. There were moments, indeed, at night, when, lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid rooms of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which, under an assumed name and in disguise, it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. But the moments such as these were rare. That curiosity about life which Lord Henry had first stirred in him as they sat together in the garden of their friend seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. Yet he was not really reckless, at any rate in his relations to society. Once or twice every month during the winter, and on each Wednesday evening while the season lasted, he would throw open to the world his beautiful house, and have the most celebrated musicians of the day to charm his guests with the wonders of their art. His little dinners in the settling of which Lord Henry always assisted him, were noted as much for the careful selection and placing of those invited as for the exquisite taste shown in the decoration of the table, with its subtle symphonic arrangements of exotic flowers and embroidered cloths, and antique plate of gold and silver. Indeed, there were many, especially among the very young men, who saw or fancied they saw in Dorian Gray the true realization of a type of which they had often dreamed in Eton or Oxford days, a type that was to combine something of a real culture of the scholar with all the grace and distinction and perfect manner of a citizen of the world. To them he seemed to be the company of those whom Dante describes as having sought to make themselves perfect by the worship of beauty. Like Gautier, he was one for whom the visible world existed. And certainly, to him life itself was the first, the greatest of the arts. A lot of tonight. And certainly to him life itself was the first, the greatest of the arts. And for it all other arts seemed to be but a preparation. Fashion, by which what is really fantastic becomes for a moment universal, and dandyism, which, in its own way, is an attempt to assert the absolute modernity of beauty, had, of course, their fascination for him. His mode of dressing, and the particular styles that from time to time he affected, had their marked influence on the young exquisites of the Mayfair balls and Pall Mall Club windows, who copied him in everything he did, and tried to reproduce the accidental charm of his graceful, though to him only half-serious, fopperies. For, while he was but too ready to accept the position that was almost immediately offered to him on his coming of age, and found, indeed, a subtle pleasure in the thought that he might really become, to the London of his own day, what to the imperial Neronian Rome the author of the Satyricon had been, yet in his own inmost heart he desired to be something more than a mere arbiter egalitarum, to be consulted on the wearing of a jewel, or the knotting of a necktie, or the conduct of a cane. He sought to elaborate some new scheme of life that would have its reasoned philosophy and its ordered principles, and to find in the spiritualizing of the senses its highest realization. The worship of the senses has often, and with much justice, been decried, men feeling a natural instinct of terror about passions and sensations that seem stronger than themselves, and that they are conscious of sharing with the less highly organized forms of existence. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission or kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant characteristic. As he looked back upon man moving through history, he was haunted by a feeling of loss. So much had been surrendered, and to such little purpose. There had been mad, wilful rejections, monstrous forms of self-torture and self-denial, whose origin was fear, and whose result was a degradation infinitely more terrible than that fancied degradation from which, in their ignorance, they had sought to escape. Nature, in her wonderful irony, driving out the anchorite to feed with the wild animals of the desert, and giving to the hermit the beasts of the field as his companions. Yes, there was to be, as Lord Henry had prophesied, a new hedonism that was to recreate life and save it from the harsh, uncomely Puritanism that is having, in our own day, its curious revival. It was to have its service of the intellect, yes. It was to have its service of the intellect, certainly, yet it was never to accept any theory or system that would involve the sacrifice of any mode of passionate experience. Its aim, indeed, was to be experience itself, and not the fruits of experience, sweet or bitter as they might be. Of the asceticism that deadens the senses, as of the vulgar profligacy that dulls them, it was to know nothing. But it was to teach man to concentrate himself upon the moments of a life that is itself but a moment. There are few of us who have not sometimes wakened before dawn, either after one of those dreamless nights that make us almost enamored of death, or one of those nights of horror and misshapen joy, when through the chambers of the brain sweep phantoms more terrible than reality itself, an instinct with that vivid life that lurks in all grotesques, and that lends to Gothic art its enduring vitality. This art being, one might fancy, especially the art of those whose minds have been troubled with the malady of reverie. Gradually, white fingers creep through the curtains as they appear to tremble. In the black, fantastic shapes, dumb shadows crawl into the corners of the room and crouch there. Outside, there is the stirring of birds among the leaves, or the sound of men going forth to their work, or the sigh and sob of the wind coming down from the hills and wandering round the silent house, as though it feared to wake the sleepers, and yet must needs call forth sleep from their purple cave. Veil after veil of thin, dusky gauze is lifted, and by degrees the forms and colours of things are restored to them, and we watch the dawn remaking the world in its antique pattern. The wan mirrors get back to their mimic life. The flameless tapers stand back where we had left them, and beside them lies the half-cut book that we had been studying, or the wired flower that we had worn at the ball, or the letter that we had been afraid to read, or that we had read too often. Nothing seems to us unchanged. Out of the unreal shadow of the night comes back the life that we had known. We have to resume it where we had left off, and there steals over us a terrible sense of the necessity for the continuance of energy in the same wearisome round of stereotyped habits, or a wild longing, it may be, that our eyelids might open some morning upon a world that had been refashioned anew in the darkness for our pleasure, a world in which things would have fresh shapes and colours and be changed, or have other secrets, a world in which the past would have little or no place, or survive at any rate, in no conscious form of obligation or regret, the remembrance even of joy having its bitterness, and the memories of pleasure their pain. It was the creation of such worlds as these that seemed to Dorian Gray to be the true object, or amongst the true objects, of life, and in his search for sensations that would be at once new and delightful, and possess that element of strangeness that is so essential to romance, he would often adopt certain modes of thought that he knew to be really alien to his nature, abandon himself to their subtle influences, and then, having, as it were, caught their colour and satisfied his intellectual curiosity, leave them with that curious indifference that is not incompatible with a real ardour of temperament, and that indeed, according to certain modern psychologists, is often a condition of it. Didn't expect to be attacked by this book so suddenly. It was rumoured of him once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic communion, and certainly the Roman ritual had always a great attraction for him. The daily sacrifice, more awful really than all the sacrifices of the antique world, stirred him as much by its superb rejection of the evidence of the senses as by the primitive simplicity of its elements and the eternal pathos of the human tragedy that it sought to symbolize. Yeah, so that's the taking the communion wafer and the little bit of grape juice as the blood and the body of Christ. It's, you know, in theory you are meant to be drinking blood and eating flesh, but then it's also, you're eating a wafer and you're drinking juice. I quite like that. He loved to kneel down on the cold marble pavement and watch the priest, in his stiff, flowered dalmatic, slowly and with white hands moving aside the veil of the tabernacle, or raising aloft the jewelled, lantern-shaped monstrance, with that pallid wafer that at times one would fain think is indeed the panis celestis, the bread of angels, or robed in the garments of the Passion of Christ, breaking the host into the chalice and smiting his breast for his sins. The fuming censers that the grave boys in their lace and scarlet tossed into the air like the gilt flowers had their subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to look with wonder at the black confessionals and long to sit in the dim shadow of one of them and listen to men and women whispering through the worn grating the true story of their lives. Dorian Gray is just a gossipy bitch who wants more gossip. But he never fell into the error of arresting his intellectual development by any formal acceptance of creed or system, or of mistaking for a house in which to live an inn that is but suitable for the sojourn of a night, or for a few hours of a night in which there are no stars and the moon is in travail. Mysticism, with its marvellous power of making common things strange to us, and the subtle antinomian, are like an antonym, so not a synonym, so different. Okay, antinomism. Mysticism, with its marvellous power of making common things strange to us, and the subtle antinomism that always seems to accompany it, moved him for a season. And for a season he inclined to the materialistic doctrines of the Darwinismus movement in Germany, and found a curious pleasure in tracing the thoughts and passions of men to some pearly cell in the brain, or some white nerve in the body, delighting in the conception of the absolute dependence of the spirit on certain physical conditions, morbid or healthy, normal or diseased. Yet, as has been said of him before, no theory of life seemed to him to be of any importance compared with life itself. He felt keenly conscious of how barren all intellectual speculation is when separated from action and experiment. He knew that the senses, no less than the soul, have their spiritual mysteries to reveal. And so he would now study perfumes and the secrets of their manufacture, distilling heavily scented oils and burning odorous gums from the east. He saw that there was no mood of the mind that had not its counterpart in the sensuous life, and set himself to discover their true relations, wondering what there was in frankincense that made one mystical, and the ambergris that stirred one's passions, and in violets that woke the memory of dead romances, and in musk that troubled the brain, and in champak that stained the imagination, and seeking often to elaborate a real psychology of perfumes, and to estimate the several influences of sweet-smelling roots and scented pollen-laden flowers, of aromatic balms and of dark, fragrant woods, of spikenard that sickens, of hovenia that makes men mad, and of aloes that are said to be able to expel melancholy from the soul. It's like that one paragraph is basically that book that came out about, 20 years ago or something. Was it Perfume? Perfume. Alright. At another time he devoted himself entirely to music, and in a long latticed room with a vermilion and gold ceiling and walls of olive green lacquer, he used to give curious concerts in which mad gypsies tore wild music from little zithers, or grave, yellow-shawled Tunisians plucked at the strained strings of monstrous lutes, while grinning negroes beat monstrously upon copper drums, and crouching upon scarlet mats, slim-turbaned Indians blew through long pipes of reed or brass, and charmed, or feigned to charm, great hooded snakes and horrible horned adders. Wow, there are a lot of slurs in that one sentence. Oh boy. I guess I want to pause very quickly to make a notice on me reading it exactly as written, which is that from what I have seen, that's the better way to go about things, rather than to make a big deal about avoiding reading things as written. That's just based on what I've gathered from what people to whom words like the N-word have said on social medias and in interviews. If people are uncomfortable with me reading things as written and would prefer that I beep things out, I can try to just say beep as I read, and I'm very happy to do that as well. It's more just trying to do my best. This is what I feel like it probably is. So, very happy to take feedback on that. Alright. The harsh intervals and strained discords of barbaric music stirred him at times when Schubert's grace and Chopin's beautiful sorrows and the mighty harmonies... Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah. And the mighty harmonies of Beethoven himself fell unheeded on his ear. He collected together from all parts of the world the strangest instruments that could be found, either in the tombs of dead nations or among the few savage tribes that have survived contact with Western civilizations, and loved to touch and try them. He had the mysterious Jura Paris of the Rio Negro Indians, that women were not allowed to look at, and that even youths may not see till they have been subjected to fasting and scourging, and the earthen jars of the Peruvians that have shrill cries of birds and flutes of human bones, such as... Wilde, stop! Because this is Oscar Wilde writing all of this. Like, this is not in Dorian Gray's voice. This one is just like Wilde was of his time, and this was the British understanding of other cultures that they had subjugated. There's a lot. Alright. And flutes of human bones, such as Alfonso de Oval, heard in Chile, and the sonorous green jaspers that are found near Cuzco, and give forth a note of singular sweetness. He had painted gourds filled with pebbles that rattled when they were shaken. The long clarin of the Mexicans, into which the performer does not blow, but through which he inhales the air. The harsh ture of the Amazon tribes, that is sounded by the sentinels who sit all day in the high trees, and can be heard, it is said, at a distance of 3 leagues. The Teponztli, I don't know how to pronounce that has 2 vibrating tongues of wood, and is beaten with sticks that are smeared with an elastic gum obtained from the milky juice of plants. The yotl bells of the Aztecs that are hung in clusters like grapes, and a huge cylindrical drum covered with the skins of great serpents, like the one that Bernal Diaz saw when he went with Cortez into the Mexican temple, and of whose doleful sound he has left us so vivid a description. The fantastic character of these instruments fascinated him, and he felt a curious delight in the thought that art, like nature, has her monsters, things of bestial shape with hideous voices. Yet after some time he wearied of them, and would sit in his box at the opera, either alone or with Lord Henry, and listening in rapture to Tannhauser, and seeing in the prelude to that great work of art a presentation of the tragedy of his own soul. Okay, actually that is kind of interesting. So on the one hand it's very noble savage to have all of this like exotic things from all of these places. On the other hand, Wilde has like gone into detail about lots and lots of different things which, you know, are genuinely possibly quite interesting if they are accurate. Like, I haven't heard of some of those musical instruments. If they exist, that sounds cool. And then you've got Dorian Gray's view on it, which is very much like pure exoticism, and also like finding them bestial and like, you know, etc. below the notice of, you know, inferior to the opera and that kind of thing, which is like also, it's, I don't know, I feel like a generous reading of this text towards Oscar Wilde could be that this is a reflection of another way in which Dorian is a shallow... I mean, it is, like, the whole paragraph is a reflection of another way in which Dorian Gray is shallow. But, like, that he's wrong about it being bestial and hideous and all of that. Or, if you want to take, like, the other, honestly, equally plausible, like, and less Oscar Wilde-friendly reading is that Oscar Wilde is just about as racist as anyone else in his time, and the way in which Dorian Gray is being shown to be shallow is just about the fact that he's become obsessed with all these things and then immediately dropped them. Not also that he's fetishizing them. So, I don't know. I find that that's kind of an interesting point at which when you're thinking about a text and, like, the author's intentions and what they could have been and what they could not be. I don't know. It makes me uncomfortable to read, but that's fine. On one occasion, he took up the study of jewels and the appearance at a costume ball as Anne de Joyce, Admiral of France, in a dress covered with 560 pearls. This taste enthralled him for years, and indeed may be said never to have left him. So he came in a dress. Amazing. At a costume ball, I see. God, it's so queer. So gay. Love this book. I mean, I say that right after that paragraph that I didn't really love, but I love the queerness. Radical for its time. This taste enthralled him for years, and indeed, it may be said never to have left him. He would often spend a whole day settling and resettling in their cases the various stones that he had collected, such as the olive green chrysoberyl that turned red by lamplight, the cymophane with its wire-like line of silver, the pistachio-coloured peridot, rose-pink and wine-yellow topazes, carbuncles of fiery scarlet with tremulous four-rayed stars, flame-red cinnamon stones, orange and violet spinels, and amethysts with their alternate layers of ruby and sapphire. He loved the red gold of the sunstone, and the moonstone's pearly whiteness, and the broken rainbow of the milky opal. He procured from Amsterdam 3 emeralds of extraordinary size and richness of colour, and had a turquoise de la Vieille Roche that was the envy of all the connoisseurs. He discovered wonderful stories also about jewels. In Alfonso's Clericalis Disciplina, a serpent was mentioned with the eye of real jacinth, and in the romantic history of Alexander, the conqueror of Emathia, was said to have found in the Vale of Jordan snakes with collars of real emeralds growing on their backs. There was a gem in the brain of the dragon, Philostratus told us, and by the exhibition of golden letters and a scarlet robe. The monster could be thrown into a magical sleep and slain. According to the great alchemist, Pierre de Boniface, the diamond rendered a man invisible, and the agate of India made him eloquent. The cornelian appeased anger, and the hyacinth provoked sleep, and the amethyst drove away the fumes of wine. The garnet cast out demons, and the hydropicus deprived the moon of her colour. The selenite waxed and waned with the moon, and the meloceus that discovers thieves could be affected only by the blood of kids. I'm pretty sure that means kid goats, not children. That wasn't slang for children yet. Leonardus Camillus had seen a white stone taken from the brain of a newly killed toad, and that was a certain antidote against poison. The bezoar that was found in the heart of the Arabian deer was a charm that could cure the plague. In the nests of the Arabian birds was the asphylates that, according to Democritus, kept the wearer from any danger by fire. So Dorian Gray is just like he's a lifestyle hippie. he's gotten really into crystals. He's an influencer who's really into crystals and has a new hobby every week. Yeah, a rich hippie. Exactly. I can see his Instagram. You know, in my mind's eye. I can just see his Instagram. And it's terrible. But very popular. God. What a twat. The king of Ceylon rode through his city with a large ruby in his hand as the ceremony of his coronation. The gates of the palace of John the priest were... Also, this is dragging on quite a bit. Like, the thing is that it's not really saying much about the character anymore. Like, I get it, Oscar Wilde. I get it. I understand Dorian Gray a bit. Enough. The gates of the palace of John the priest were made of sardius, with a horn of the horned snake inwrought so that no man might bring poison within. Over the gable were 2 golden apples, in which were 2 carbuncles, so that the gold might shine by day and the carbuncles by night. In Lodge's strange romance, A Marguerite of America, it was stated that in the chamber of the queen one could behold all the chaste ladies of the world, enchased out of silver, looking through fair mirrors of chrysolites, carbuncles, sapphires, and green emeralds. I love old spellings. Marco Polo had seen the inhabitants of Zipangu place rose-coloured pearls in the mouths of the dead. This is just Oscar Wilde wanting to share. This is like the equivalent of an autistic or a ADHD rant about something someone's interested in at this point, I feel. Like it's gone from providing information about the character that we're reading about to Oscar Wilde just wanting to describe things he's heard about. Like, he's like, oh, and did you hear about this? And did you hear about this? And did you hear about this? A sea monster had been enamoured of the pearl that the diver brought to King Perozes, and had slain the thief, and mourned for 7 moons over its loss. When the Huns lured the king into a great pit, he flung it away. Procopius tells the story, nor was it ever found again, though the Emperor Anastasius offered 500 weight of gold pieces for it. The King of Malabar had shown a certain Venetian a rosary of 304 pearls, one for every god that he worshipped. When the Duke of Valentinois, son of Alexander VI, visited Louis XII of France, his horse was loaded with gold leaves, according to Brantome, and his cap had double rows of rubies that threw out the great light. Charles of England had ridden in stirrups hung with 421 diamonds. Richard II had a coat valued at 30,000 marks, which would cover with Bala's rubies. Hall described Henry VIII, on his way to the Tower previous to his coronation, as wearing a jacket of raised gold, the placard embroidered with diamonds and other rich stones, and a great borderic about his neck of large balasses. The favourites of James I wore earrings of emeralds set in gold filigree. Edward II gave to Piers Gaveston a suit of red gold armour studded with jacinths, and a collar of gold roses set with turquoise stones, and a skull-cap parsemé with pearls. Henry II wore jewelled gloves reaching to the elbow, and had a hawk glove sewn with 12 rubies and 52 great orients. The ducal hat of Charles the Rash, the last Duke of Burgundy of his race, was hung with pearl-shaped pearls studded with sapphires. Okay, so that is... We've spent 1, 2, 3 long paragraphs talking about stories about jewels, plus one more about jewels themselves. Honestly, it just feels like Oscar Wilde didn't want to have, research he'd done, stories he'd gathered be wasted. No, this isn't a waste of time. Here, have this. Kill your darlings, dear. Alright. How exquisite life had once been! How gorgeous in its pomp and decoration! Even to read of the luxury of the dead was wonderful. Then he turned his... Oh no, now we're gonna get... Then he turned his attention to embroideries, and to the tapestries that performed the office of frescoes in the chill rooms of the northern nations of Europe. As he investigated the subject, and he always had an extraordinary faculty of becoming absolutely absorbed for the moment in whatever he took up. Dorian Gray has ADHD! He was almost saddened by the reflection of the ruin that time brought on beautiful and wonderful things. He, at any rate, had escaped that. Summer followed summer, and the yellow jonquils bloomed and died many times, and the nights of horror repeated the story of their shame. But he was unchanged. No winter marred his face or stained his flower-like bloom. How different it was with material things. Where had they passed to? Where was the great crocus-coloured robe on which the gods fought against the giants, that had been worked by brown girls for the pleasure of Athena? Where the huge velarium that Nero had stretched across the Colosseum at Rome, that Titan's sail of purple on which was represented the starry sky and Apollo driving a chariot drawn by white gilt-reined steeds? He longed to see the curious table napkins wrought for the priest of the sun, on which were displayed all the dainties and viands that could be wanted for a feast. The mortuary cloth of King Chilperic, with its 300 golden bees. The fantastic robes that excited the indignation of the Bishop of Pontus, and were figured with lions, panthers, bears, dogs, forests, rocks, hunters, all, in fact, that a painter can copy from nature. And the coat that Charles of Orleans once wore, on the sleeves of which were embroidered the verses of a song beginning, Madame, je suis tout joyeux, the musical accompaniment of the words being wrought in gold thread, and each note, of square shape in those days, formed with 4 pearls. He read of the room that was prepared at the Palace of Reims for the use of Queen Joan of Burgundy, and was decorated with 1,321 parrots, made in broidery and blazoned with the king's arms, and 561 butterflies whose wings were similarly ornamented with the arms of the queen, were the wall worked in gold. Catherine de Medicis had a mourning bed made for her of black velvet powdered with crescents and suns. Its curtains were of damask, with leafy wreaths and garlands figured upon a gold and silver ground, and fringed along the edges with broideries and pearls, and it stood in a room hung with the rows of the Queen's devices in cut black velvet upon a cloth of silver. Louis XIV had gold-embroidered caryatides 15 feet high in his apartment. The state bed of Sobieski, King of Poland, was made of Smyrna gold brocade, embroidered in turquoises, with verses from the Koran. Its supports were of silver gilt, beautifully chased and profusely set with emerald and jewelled medallions. It had been taken from the Turkish camp before Vienna, and the standard of Muhammad had stood beneath the tremulous gilt of its canopy. Okay, so actually I take it back a bit. I mean, I think what Oscar Wilde is really trying to do is to describe the sensuous beauties of life to us so that we feel the sensuous beauties of life as well, when he goes on these big rants about describing all the different kinds of embroidery. Like, with the embroidery, I really got it a bit more. Like, picturing it in its detail? I don't know. Anyway. And so, for a whole year, he sought to accumulate the most exquisite specimens that he could find of textile and embroidered work, getting the dainty Delhi muslins, finely wrought with gold thread palmates, and stitched over with iridescent beetles' wings, the Dhaka gauzes that from their transparency are known in the East as woven air and running water and evening dew, strange-figured clothes from Java, elaborate yellow Chinese hangings, books bound in tawny satins, or fair blue silks, and wrought with fleur-de-lis, birds and images, veils of lachis worked in Hungary point, Sicilian brocades and stiff Spanish velvets, Georgian work with its gilt coins, and Japanese fukusas with their green-toned golds and their marvelously plumed birds. He had a special passion also for for ecclesiastical. That is how you say it, right? Anyway. He had a special passion also for ecclesiastical vestments, as indeed he had for everything connected with the service of the church. In the long cedar chests that lined the west gallery of his house, he had stored away many rare and beautiful specimens of what is really the raiment of the Bride of Christ, who must wear purple and jewels and fine linen that she may hide the pallid, macerated body that is worn by the suffering that she seeks for, and wounded by self-inflicted pain. He possessed a gorgeous cope of crimson silk and gold thread damask, figured with a repeating pattern of golden pomegranates, and set in 6-petaled formal blossoms, beyond which, on either side, was the pine-apple device wrought in seed pearls. The orphreys were divided into panels, representing scenes from the life of the Virgin, and the coronation of the Virgin was figured in coloured silks upon the hood. This was Italian work of the 15th century. Another cope was of green velvet, embroidered with the heart-shaped groups with acanthus leaves, from which spread long-stemmed white blossoms, the details of which were picked out with silver thread and coloured crystals. The morse bore a seraph's head in gold thread raised work. The orphreys were woven in a diaper of red and gold silks, and were starred with medallions of many saints and martyrs, among whom was Saint Sebastian. He had chasubles also of amber-coloured silk, and blue silk, and gold brocade, and yellow silk damask and cloth of gold, figured with representations of the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ, and embroidered with lions and peacocks and other emblems. Dalmatics of white satin and pink silk damask, decorated with tulips and dolphins and fleur-de-lis, altar frontals of crimson velvet and blue linen, and many corporals, chalice veils, and sudaria. In the mystic offices to which such things were put, there was something that quickened his imagination. Oh my gosh! Come on! Yeah, see you. Thanks for stopping in. Alright. I just need a sec. I need to have a drink of water. Stop listing the inventory of Dorian Gray's house now, please. Please. Please let something happen in this book. For these treasures, and everything that he collected in his lovely house, were to be to him means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape for a season from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. Okay, here we go. Something's happening. Upon the walls of the lonely locked room where he had spent so much of his boyhood, he had hung with his own hands the terrible portrait of his life, and in front of it had draped a purple and gold pall as a curtain. For weeks he would not go there, would forget the hideous painted thing, and get back his light heart, his wonderful joyousness, his passionate absorption in the mere existence. Then suddenly, some night, he would creep out of the house, go down to the dreadful place near the Bluegate Fields, and stay there, day after day, until he was driven away. On his return he would sit in front of the picture sometimes, loathing it and himself, but filled, at other times, with that pride of individualism that is half the fascination of sin, and smiling with secret pleasure at the misshapen shadow that had to bear the burden that should have been his own. After a few years he could not endure to be long out of England, and gave up the villa that he had shared at Trouville with Lord Henry, as well as the little white walled-in house at Algiers, where they had more than once spent the winter. So they're definitely fucking. Like, 100%. He hated to be separated from the picture that was such a part of his life, and was also afraid that during his absence someone might gain access to the room in spite of the elaborate bars that he had caused to be placed upon the door. He was quite conscious that this would tell them nothing. It was true that the portrait still preserved, under all the foulness and ugliness of the face, its marked likeness to himself, But what could they learn from that? He would laugh at anyone who tried to taunt him. He had not painted it. What was it to him how vile and full of shame it looked? Even if he told them, would they believe it? Yet he was afraid. Sometimes, when he was down at his great house in Nottinghamshire, entertaining the fashionable young men of his own rank who were his chief companions. Yeah, they were. And astounding the county by the wanton luxury and gorgeous splendour of his mode of life, he would suddenly leave his guests and rush back to town to see that the door had not been tampered with and that the picture was still there. What if it should be stolen? The mere thought made him cold with horror. Surely the world would know his secret then. Perhaps the world already suspected it. For while he fascinated many, there were not a few who distrusted him. He was very nearly blackballed at the West End Club, of which his birth and social position fully entitled him to become a member, and it was said that on one occasion, when he was brought by a friend into the smoking room of the Churchill, the Duke of Berwick and another gentleman got up in a marked manner and went out. Curious stories became current about him after he had passed his 25th year. It was rumoured that he had been seen brawling with foreign sailors in a low den in the distant parts of Whitechapel, and that he consorted with thieves and coiners, and knew the mysteries of their trade. His extraordinary absences became notorious, and when he used to reappear again in society, men would whisper to each other in corners, and pass him with a sneer, or look at him with cold, searching eyes, as though they were determined to discover his secret. Of such insolences and attempted slights he, of course, took no notice, and in the opinion of most people his frank, debonair manner, and his charming boyish smile, and the infinite grace of that wonderful youth that seemed never to leave him, were in themselves a sufficient answer to the calumnies, for so they termed them, that were circulated about him. It was remarked, however, that some of those who had been most intimate with him appeared, after a time, to shun him. Women who had wildly adored him, and for his sake had braved all social censure and set convention at defiance, were seen to grow pallid with shame or horror if Dorian Gray entered the room. Yet these whispered scandals only increased in the eyes of the many his strange and dangerous charm. His great wealth was a certain element of security. Society, civilized society at least, is never very ready to believe anything to the detriment of those who are both rich and fascinating. Now that's true. An ageless line. It feels instinctively that manners are of more importance than morals, and, in its opinion, the highest respectability is of much less value than the possession of a good chef. And after all, it is a very poor consolation to be told that the man who had given one a bad dinner or a poor wine is irreproachable in his private life. Even the cardinal virtues cannot atone for a half-cold entrees, as Lord Henry remarked once in a discussion on the subject, and there is possibly a good deal to be said for his view. For the canons of good society are, or should be, the same as the canons of art. Form is absolutely essential to it. It should have the dignity of ceremony, as well as its unreality, and should combine the insincere character of a romantic play with the wit and beauty that make such plays delightful to us. Is insincerity such a terrible thing? I think not. It is merely a method by which we can multiply our personalities. Alright, so the next line is, such at any rate was Dorian Gray's opinion. I don't know, Oscar Wilde. We'll see. I can't tell with this guy what's the author and what's the character sometimes. Anyway, that's fun. Such, at any rate, was Dorian Gray's opinion. He used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceive the ego in a man as a simple thing, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him, man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, a complex multiform creature that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion, and whose very flesh was tainted with the monstrous melodies of the dead. He loved to stroll through the gaunt, cold picture gallery of his country house and look at the various portraits of those whose blood flowed in his veins. Here was Philip Herbert, described by Francis Osborne in his Memories of the Reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James, as one who was caressed by the court for his handsome face, which kept him not long in company. Was it young Herbert's life that he sometimes led? Had some strange poisonous germ crept from body to body until it had reached his own? Was it some dim sense of that ruined grace that had made him so suddenly, and almost without cause, give utterance, in Basil Hallward's studio, to the mad prayer that had so changed his life? Here, in gold-embroidered red doublet, jewelled surcoat, and gilt-edged ruff and wristbands, stood Sir Anthony Sherrod, with his silver and black armour piled at his feet. What had this man's legacy been? Had the lover of Giovanna of Naples bequeathed him some inheritance of sin and shame? Were his own actions merely the dreams that the dead man had not dared to realize? Here, from the fading canvas, smiled Lady Elizabeth Devereux, in her gauze hood, pale stomacher, and pink-slashed sleeves. Ugh, I am finding this chapter a chore, honestly. A flower was in her right hand, and her left clasped an enamelled collar of white and damask roses. On a table by her side lay a mandolin and an apple. There were large green rosettes upon her little pointed shoes. He knew her life and the strange stories that were told about her lovers. Had he something of her temperament in him? These oval, heavy-lidded eyes seemed to look curiously at him. What of George Willoughby with his powdered hair and fantastic patches? How evil he looked! Patches. Interesting. The face was saturnine. Oh, I guess like age spots, maybe. The face was saturnine and swarthy, with the sensual lips seemed to be twisted with disdain. Delicate lace ruffles fell over the lean yellowed hands that were so overladen with rings. He had been a macaroni... Oh, what? He had been a macaroni of the 18th century. Okay, hang on. I'm going to see if there's an end note about the macaroni of the 18th century. Give me a moment. Blah, 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 blah. Lady Elizabeth Devereux. Ugh, there's no note. What's a macaroni? Besides the pasta. Macaroni. Historical. A macaroni, or formerly macaroni, in mid-18th century England was a fashionable fellow who dressed and even spoke in an outlandishly affected and epicene manner. The term pejoratively referred to a man who exceeded the ordinary bounds of fashion in terms of clothes, fastidious eating, and gambling. Right, alright. That paints a picture. I'm glad I looked that up. That's fun. Okay. Who is the macaroni? George Willoughby, with his powdered hair and fantastic patches. He had been a macaroni of the 18th century, and the fiend, in his youth, of Lord Ferrars. What of the second Lord Beckenham, the companion of the Prince Regent in his wildest days, and one of the witnesses at the secret marriage of Mrs. Fitzherbert? How proud and handsome he was, with his chestnut curls and insolent pose! What passions had he bequeathed? The world had looked upon him as infamous. He had led the orgies at Carlton House. The star of the Garter glittered upon his breast. Beside him hung a portrait of his wife, a pallid, thin-lipped woman in black. Her blood also stirred within him. How curious it all seemed. And his mother, with her Lady Hamilton face and her moist, wine-dashed lips. He knew what he had got from her. He had got from her his beauty and his passion for the beauty of others. She laughed at him in her loose bacchante dress. There were vine leaves in her hair, the purple spilled from the cup she was holding. The carnations of the painting had withered, but the eyes were still wonderful in their depth and brilliancy of colour. They seemed to follow him wherever he went. Yet one had ancestors in literature as well as in one's own race, nearer perhaps in type and temperament, many of them, and certainly with an influence of which one was more absolutely conscious. There were times when it appeared to Dorian Gray that the whole of history was merely a record of his own life, not as he had lived it in act and circumstance, but as his imagination had created it for him, as it had been in his brain and in his passions. He felt that he had known them all, those strange, terrible figures that had passed across the stage of the world and made sin so marvellous and so evil and so full of subtlety. It seemed to him that in some mysterious way their lives had been his own. The hero of the wonderful novel that had so influenced his life had himself known this curious fancy. In the 7th chapter he tells how, crowned with laurel, lest lightning might strike him, he had sat, as Tiberius, in a garden at the Capri, reading the shameful books of the elephantis white dwarf, and peacocks strutted about him, and the flute-player mocked the swinger and the censer. And as Caligula, he had caroused with the green-shirted jockeys in their stables, and supped in an ivory manger with a jewel-fronted horse. And as Domitian had wandered through a corridor lined with marble mirrors, looking round with haggard eyes for the reflection of the dagger that was to end his days, and stick with that ennui, that terrible tedium vitae, that came on those whose that came to those that came on that terrible tedium vitae that comes on those to whom life denies nothing, and had peered through a clear emerald at the red shambles of the circus, and then, in a litter of pearl and purple drawn by silver-shod mules, been carried through the street of pomegranates to a house of gold, and heard men cry on Nero Caesar as he passed by. And as Elagabalus had painted his face with colours, and piled the distaff among the women, and brought the moon from Carthage, and given her in mystic marriage to the sun. Ay, how much left? Woo, soon. Over and over again, Dorian used to read this fantastic chapter, and the 2 chapters immediately following, in which, as in some curious tapestries or cunningly wrought enamels, were pictured the awful and beautiful forms of those whom vice and blood and weariness had made monstrous or mad. Filippo, Duke of Milan, who slew his wife and painted her lips with the scarlet poison that her lover might suck death from the dead thing that he fondled. Jeez, that's dark. I like it. Wow. Like that. Pietro Barbi, the Venetian, known as Paul II, who sought in his vanity to assume the title of Formosus, and whose tiara, valued at 200,000 florins, was brought at the price of a terrible sin. Gian Maria Visconti, who used hounds to chase living men, and whose murdered body was covered with roses by a harlot who had loved him. The Borgia on his white horse, with fratricide riding beside him, and his mantle stained with the blood of Perotto. Man, shout out to Sandy. We watched the Borgias together. That's wild. So that's a salacious show. Good fun. Pietro Riario, the young Cardinal Archbishop of Florence, child and minion of Sixtus IV, whose beauty was equalled only by his debauchery, and who received Leonora of Aragon in a pavilion of white and crimson silk, filled with nymphs and centaurs, and gilded by a boy, that he might serve at the feast as Ganymede or Hylas. Ezelin, whose melancholy could be cured only by the spectacle of death, and who had a passion for red blood, as other men have for red wine. The son of the fiend, as was reported, and one who had cheated his father at dice when gambling with him for his own soul. Giambattista Cibo, who in mockery took the name of Innocent, and whose torpid veins the blood of 3 lads was infused by a Jewish doctor. Sigismondo Malatesta, the lover of Isotta, and the lord of Rimini, whose effigy was burned at Rome as the enemy of God, and a man who strangled Polissena with a napkin and gave poison to Ginevra d'Este in a cup of emerald, and in honour of a shameful passion built a pagan church for Christian worship. Charles VI, who had so wildly adored his brother's wife that a leper had warned him of the insanity that was coming on him, and who, when his brain had sickened and grown strange, could only be soothed by Saracen cards painted with the images of love and death and madness. And in his trimmed jerkin and jewelled cap, and acanthus-like curls, Griffonetto Baglioni, who slew Astore with his bride, and Simonetto with his page, and whose comeliness was such that, as he lay dying in the yellow plaza of Perugia, those who had hated him could not choose but weep, and Atalanta, who had cursed him, blessed him. There was a horrible fascination in them all. He saw them at night, and they troubled his imagination in the day. The Renaissance knew of strange manners of poisoning by a helmet and a light torch, by an embroidered glove and a jewelled fan, by a gilded pomander on an amber chain. Dorian Gray had been poisoned by a book. There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. Okay. Whew. Well, that's that chapter done. Ay. I've really enjoyed this book, but that chapter was a lot. Okay. My thought is some beautiful and interesting descriptions. A lot of racism. I think Oscar Wilde's probably a bit of a twat, as well as Dorian Gray is a lot of a twat. And I think that all of the beautiful description and his fascination with the before, like the things about the jewels, the things about the embroidery, all of that is meant to draw you into the fascination of like, oh yes, this is really beautiful, this is something that's lovely. And then you get to the last couple of paragraphs, it's like, and also he was really fascinated by this. He saw these horrible acts as just the same beauty as all these other unquestionably beautiful things. And, you know, he looks upon the beauty of a massacre with the same eye as he looks upon the beauty of a scene painted of the Virgin Mary. And, you know, this is a book about sin and the devil and God and all of that kind of thing, as well as it is about the stuff I kind of am interested in, which is a depiction of gay love, which is part of it as well. One of the things I find interesting that I was thinking about before is that there is, like, this is a book about sin and about people who sin and about how terrible they are and how fascinating they find things. And, you know, it's meant to be kind of like a dark psychology thing, but also like the fascination of sin itself and you know, sinful acts and all of that. I'm using the word sin a lot. This is more because that's what the book is talking about than definitely not my own beliefs. But it also then has, like, obviously he's self-censored this book a lot, like it's not super overt, but Basil, who is the he's the good man in this book, like he is virtue in this book. He's the good path and kindness, but he's the one who's really in love with Dorian, and I find that interesting that it's not, I think that's one of the things that makes this a book that I wanted to read, which is that, like, the fact that his debauchery is gay a lot of the time, as well as, you know, he's clearly, obviously, doing badly by a lot of women in society. That's not where the sin lies. Like, that's not mentioned as a sin. Even if it is also one that he's committing. because Basil also has those feelings and has those feelings more strongly than Dorian or Henry does. I like that. All right, I need a break and possibly a big drink after that. So, see ya in a minute or 5. Be right back. All right, hey everybody. I'm back. And yeah, I've filled my wine glass with pretend champers again. Because I need it. Yeah, it's just beer. You gotta be classy when you're being Dorian Gray. That was a chore. Is a pretend champers kind of night? Yeah, I bet you get me right now. It's a very liquid themed night across the country. It's a wet night. Dorian Gray always has one. Anyway, yeah, no, I said this in the chat. I'll say it again. That chapter took an hour and a half. That was an hour and a half of lists of things. It was an hour and a half. I'm doing another chapter. Possibly just one more. We'll see. I think probably just one more. But I think there's dialogue in this chapter. Imagine. Alright. Chapter 12. It was on the 9th of November, the eve of his own 28th birthday, as he often remembered afterwards. He was walking home about 11 o'clock from Lord Henry's, where he had been dining, and was wrapped in heavy furs, as the night was cold and foggy. At the corner of Grosvenor Square and South Audley Street, a man passed him in the mist, walking very fast, and with the collar of his grey ulster turned up. He had a bag in his hand. Dorian recognized him. It was Basil Hallward. A strange sense of fear, for which he could not account, came over him. He made no sign of recognition, and went on quickly in the direction of his own house. Just blanked him. But Hallward had seen him. Dorian heard him first stopping on the pavement and then hurrying after him. In a few moments his hand was on his arm. "Dorian! What an extraordinary piece of luck! I have been waiting for you in your library ever since 9 o'clock. Finally I took pity on your tired servant and told him to go to bed, as he let me out. I am off to Paris by midnight train, and I particularly wanted to see you before I left. I thought it was you, or rather your fur coat, as you passed me, but I wasn't quite sure. Didn't you recognize me?" "In this fog, my dear Basil? I can't even recognize Grosvenor Square. I believe my house is somewhere about here, but I don't feel at all certain about it. I am sorry you are going away, as I have not seen you for ages. But I suppose you will be back soon." "No. I am going to be out of England for 6 months. I intend to take a studio in Paris and shut myself up till I have finished a great picture I have in my head. However, it wasn't about myself I wanted to talk. Here we are at your door. Let me come in for a moment. I have something to say to you." "I shall be charmed. But won't you miss your train?" said Dorian Gray languidly, as he passed up the steps and opened the door with his latchkey. The lamplight struggled out through the fog, and Hallward looked at his watch.
I have heaps of time, he answered. The train doesn't go till 12:15, and it is only just 11. In fact, I was on my way to the club to look for you when I met you. You see, I shan't have any delay about luggage, as I have sent on my heavy things. All I have with me is in this bag, and I can easily get to Victoria in 20 minutes.
Dorian looked at him and smiled. What a way for a fashionable painter to travel. A Gladstone bag and an ulster. Come in or the fog will get into the house. And mind you don't talk about anything serious. Nothing is serious nowadays. At least nothing should be. Hallward shook his head as he entered and followed Dorian into the library. There was a bright wood fire blazing in a large open hearth. The lamps were lit, and an open Dutch silver spirit case stood, with some siphons of soda water and a large cut-glass tumblers on a little marqueterie table.
You see, your servant made me quite at home, Dorian. He gave me everything I wanted, including your best gold-tipped cigarettes. He is a most hospitable creature. I like him much better than the Frenchman you used to have. What has become of the Frenchman, by the by?
Oh, Dorian was paranoid about the Frenchman. I remember that. Dorian shrugged his shoulders. I believe he married Lady Radley's maid and has established her in Paris as an English dressmaker. Anglemaine is very fashionable over there now, I hear. It seems silly of the French, doesn't it? But do you know, he was not at all a bad servant. I never liked him, but I had nothing to complain about. One often imagines things that are quite absurd. He was really very devoted to me and seemed quite sorry when he went away. Have another brandy and soda? Or would you like a hock and seltzer? I always take a hock and seltzer myself. There is sure to be some in the next room.
Thanks, I won't have anything more,
said the painter, taking his cap and coat off and throwing them on the bag that he had placed in the corner.
And now, my dear fellow, I want to speak to you seriously.
Don't frown like that.
You make it so much more difficult for me.
What is this all about? Cried Dorian in his petulant way, flinging himself down on the sofa. I love how often they fling themselves down onto a divan. It's just so good. Flinging himself down on the sofa. I hope it is not about myself. I am tired of myself tonight. I should like to be somebody else. It is about yourself, answered Hallward in his grave, deep voice, and I must say it to you. I shall only keep you half an hour. Dorian sighed and lit a cigarette. Half an hour, he murmured. It is not much to ask of you, Dorian, and it is entirely for your own sake that I am speaking. I think it right that you should know that the most dreadful things are being said against you in London. I don't wish to know anything about them. I love scandals about other people, but scandals about myself don't interest me. They have not got the charm of novelty. They must interest you, Dorian. Every gentleman is interested in his good name. You don't want people to talk of you as something vile and degraded. Of course you have your position and your wealth and all of that kind of thing, but position and wealth are not everything. Mind you, I don't believe these rumours at all. At least I can't believe them when I see you. Sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed. People talk sometime of secret vices. There are no such things. If a wretched man has a vice, it shows itself in the lines of his mouth, the droop of his eyelids, the moulding of his hands even. Somebody, I won't mention his name, but you know him, came to me last year to have his portrait done. I had never seen him at the time, though I have heard a good deal since. He offered an extravagant price. I refused him. There was something in the shape of his fingers that I hated. I know now that I was quite right in what I fancied about him. His life is dreadful, but you, Dorian, with your pure, bright, innocent face, and your marvellous, untroubled youth... Dorian, with your beautiful personality. I can't believe anything against you, and yet I see you very seldom,
and you never come down to the studio now. And when I am away from you, and I hear all these hideous things that people are whispering about you, I don't know what to say. Why is it, Dorian, that a man like the Duke of Berwick leaves the room of a club when you enter it? Why is it so many gentlemen in London will neither go to your house nor invite you to theirs? You used to be a friend of Lady Staveley. You used to be a friend of Lord Staveley. I met him at dinner last week. Your name happened to come up in conversation in connection with the miniatures you have lent to the exhibition at Dudley. Staveley curled his lip and said that you might have the most artistic tastes, but that you were a man whom no pure-minded girl should be allowed to know, and whom no chaste woman should sit in the same room with. I reminded him that I was a friend of yours and asked him what he meant. He told me. He told me right out before everybody. It was horrible. Why is your friendship so fatal to young men? There was that wretched boy in the Guards who committed suicide. You were his great friend. There was Sir Henry Ashton, who had to leave England with a tarnished name. You and he were inseparable. What about Adrian Singleton and his dreadful end? What about Lord Kent's only son and his career? I met his father yesterday in St. James Street. He seemed broken with shame and sorrow. What about the young Duke of Perth? What sort of life has he got now? What gentleman would associate with him?
Stop, Basil. You were talking about things of which you know nothing, said Dorian Gray, biting his lip with a note of infinite contempt in his voice. You ask me why Berwick leaves a room when I enter it. It is because I know everything about his life, not because he knows anything about mine. With such blood as he has in his veins, how could his record be clean? You ask me about Henry Ashton and young Perth. Did I teach the one of his vices and the other of his debauchery? If Kent's silly son takes his wife from the streets, what is that to me? If Adrian Singleton writes his friend's name across a bill, am I his keeper? I know how people chatter in England. The middle classes air their moral prejudices over their gross dinner tables and whisper about what they call the profligacies of their betters in order to try and pretend that they are in smart society and on intimate terms with the people they slander. In this country, it is enough for a man to have distinction and brains for every common tongue to wag against him. And what sort of lives do these people, who pose as being moral, lead themselves? My dear fellow, you forget that we are in the native land of the hypocrite.
Dorian, cried Hallward, that is not the question. England is bad enough, I know, and English society is all wrong. That is the reason I want you to be fine. You have not been fine. One has a right to judge of a man by the effect he has over his friends. Yours seem to lose all sense of honour, of goodness, of purity. You have filled them with a madness for pleasure. They have gone down into the depths. You led them there. Yes, you led them there, and yet you can smile as you are smiling now. And there is worse behind. I know you and Harry are inseparable. Surely for that reason, if for none other, you should not have made his sister's name a byword. Take care, Basil. You go too far. I must speak, and you must listen. You shall listen. When you met Lady Gwendolen, not a breath of scandal had ever touched her. Is there a single decent woman in London now who would drive with her in the park? Why, even her children are not allowed to live with her. Then there are other stories that you have been seen creeping at dawn out of dreadful houses and slinking in disguise into the foulest dens in London. Are they true? Can they be true? When I first heard them, I laughed. I hear them now and they make me shudder. What about your country house and the life that is led there? Dorian, you don't know what is said about you. I won't tell you that I don't want to preach to you. I remember Harry saying once that every man who turned himself into an amateur curate for the moment always began by saying that, and then proceeded to break his word. I do want to preach to you. I want you to lead such a life as will make the world respect you. I want you to have a clean name and a fair record. I want you to get rid of the dreadful people you associate with. Don't shrug your shoulders like that. Don't be so indifferent. You have a wonderful influence. Let it be for good, not for evil. They say that you corrupt everyone with whom you become intimate, and that it is quite sufficient for you to enter a house for shame of some kind to follow after. I don't know whether it is so or not. How should I know? But it is said of you. I am told things that it seems impossible to doubt. Lord Gloucester was one of my greatest friends at Oxford. He showed me a letter that his wife had written to him when she was dying alone in her villa in Mentone. Your name was implicated in the most terrible confession I ever read. I told him that it was absurd, that I knew you thoroughly, and that you were incapable of anything of the kind. Know you? I wonder, do I know you? Before I could answer that, I should have to see your soul.
Hold on 1 second. Click through the starting soon. Starting soon, now! Alright.
Know you? I wonder, do I know you? Before I could answer that, I should have to see your soul.
To see my soul, muttered Dorian Gray, starting up from the sofa and turning up from white from fear.
Yes,
answered Hallward gravely. And with deep-toned sorrow in his voice.
To see your soul. But only God can do that.
A bitter laugh of mockery broke from the lips of the younger man. You shall see it yourself, tonight, he cried, seizing a lamp from the table. Come, it is your own handiwork. Why shouldn't you look at it? You can tell the world about it afterwards if you choose. Nobody would believe you. If they did believe you, they would like me all the better for it. I know the age better than you do, though you will prate about it so tediously. Come, I tell you. I have chatted enough about corruption. Now you shall look it face to face. There was a madness of pride in every word he uttered. He stamped his foot upon the ground in his boyish, insolent manner. He felt a terrible joy at the thought that someone else would share his secrets, and that the man who had painted the portrait that was the origin of all his shame was to be burdened for the rest of his life with the hideous memory of what he had done. Yes, he continued, coming closer to him and looking steadfastly into his stern eyes. I shall now show you my soul. You shall see the thing that you fancy only God can see. Hallward started back. This is blasphemy, Dorian, he cried. You must not say things like that. They are horrible and they don't mean anything. You think so? He laughed again. I know so. As for what I said to you tonight, I said it for your good. You know I have always been a staunch friend to you. And don't touch me. Finish what you have to say. A twisted flash of pain shot across the painter's face. He paused for a moment, and a wild feeling of pity came over him. After all, what right had he to pry into the life of Dorian Gray? If he had done a tithe of what rumoured about him, how much he must have suffered. Then he straightened himself up and walked over to the fireplace and stood there, looking at the burning logs with their frost-like ashes and their throbbing cores of flame. I am waiting, Basil, said the young man in a hard, clear voice. He turned around. What I have to say is this, he cried. You must give me some answer to these horrible charges that are made against you. If you tell me that they are absolutely untrue from beginning to end, I shall believe you. Deny them, Dorian, deny them. Can't you see what I am going through? My God! Don't tell me that you are bad and corrupt and shameful. Dorian Gray smiled. There was a curl of contempt in his lips. Come upstairs, Basil, he said quietly. I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it is written. I shall show it to you if you come with me. I shall come with you, Dorian, if you wish it. I see I have missed my train. That makes no matter. I can go tomorrow. But don't ask me to read anything tonight. All I want is a plain answer to my question. That shall be given to you upstairs. I could not give it here. You will not have to read long.
Whoa. Okay, that was a good chapter. I made up for it. What's gonna happen? Oh my god. Dorian Gray is showing a secret to Basil Hallward. That can't be good. That cannot be good. That was a short chapter too.
My advice to anyone reading this book: skip chapter 12.
Skim read chapter 12. I don't know. Delicious.
Ooh. I think I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, no. So chapter 12 was the good one that we just read. Chapter 11 was the heavy one. Yeah. Skip chapter 11. That's my bad. My bad. I was making it wrong. Skip chapter 11. That's my advice. Don't skip chapter 12. Chapter 12 is great. It's really dramatic. Alright, there we go. Fixed it. Thanks, David. I'm just gonna keep going. I want to find out what happens. Chapter 13. Oh, it's chapter 13! Unlucky 13! Something's gonna go down! Probably Basil. Chapter 13. He passed out of the room and began the ascent, Basil Hallward following close behind. They walked softly, as men do instinctively at night. The lamp cast fantastic shadows on the walls and staircase. A rising wind made some of the windows rattle. When they reached the top landing, Dorian set the lamp down on the floor, and taking out the key, turned it in the lock. "You insist on knowing, Basil?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes." "I am delighted," he answered, smiling. Then he added somewhat harshly, "You are the one man in the world who is entitled to know everything about me. You have had more to do with my life than you think." And taking up the lamp, he opened the door and went in. A cold current of air passed them, and the light shot up for a moment in a flame of murky orange. He shuddered. "Shut the door behind you," he whispered, as he placed the lamp on the table. Hallward glanced round him with a puzzled expression. The room looked as if it had not been lived in for years. A faded Flemish tapestry, a curtained picture, an old Italian cassone, and an almost empty bookcase. That was all that it seemed to contain, besides a chair and table. As Dorian Gray was lighting a half-burned candle that was standing on the mantelshelf, he saw that the whole place was covered with dust, and that the carpet was in holes. A mouse ran scuffling behind the wainscoting. There was a damp odor of mildew. "So, you think it is only God who sees the soul, Basil? Draw that curtain back and you will see mine." The voice that spoke was cold and cruel. "You are mad, Dorian. Or playing the part," muttered Hallward, frowning. "You won't? Then I must do it myself," said the young man, and he tore the curtain from its rod and flung it on the ground. An exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips as he saw in the dim light the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in its expression that filled him with disgust and loathing. Good heavens! It was Dorian Gray's own face that he was looking at. The horror, whatever it was, had not yet entirely spoiled that marvellous beauty. There was still some gold in the thinning hair and some scarlet on the sensual mouth. The sodden eyes had kept some of the loveliness of their blue. The noble curves had not yet completely passed away from the chiselled nostrils and from plastic throat. Yes, It was Dorian himself. But who had done it? He seemed to recognize his own brushwork, and the frame was his own design. The idea was monstrous, yet he felt afraid. He seized the lighted candle and held it to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his own name, traced in long letters of bright vermilion. It was some foul parody, some infamous ignoble satire. He had never done that. Still, it was his own picture. He knew it, and he felt as if his blood had changed in a moment from fire to sluggish ice. His own picture. What did it mean? Why had it altered? He turned and looked at Dorian Gray, with the eyes of a sick man. His mouth twitched, and his parched tongue seemed unable to articulate. He passed his hand across his forehead. It was dank with clammy sweat. The young man was leaning against the mantel shelf, watching him with that strange expression that one sees on the faces of those who are absorbed in a play when some great artist is acting. It was neither real sorrow in it, nor real joy. There was simply the passion of the spectator, with perhaps a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had taken the flower out of his coat and was smelling it, or pretending to do so. "What does this mean?" cried Hallward at last. His own voice sounded shrill and curious in his ears. "Years ago, when I was a boy," said Dorian Gray, crushing the flower in his hand, "you met me, flattered me, and taught me to be vain of my good looks. One day you introduced me to a friend of yours who explained to me the wonder of youth, and you finished a portrait of me that revealed to me the wonder of beauty. In a mad moment that even now I don't know whether I regret or not, I made a wish. Perhaps you would call it a prayer." "I remember it. Oh, how well I remember it. No. The thing is impossible. The room is damp. Mildew has got into the canvas. The paints I used had some wretched mineral poison in them. I tell you, the thing is impossible." "What is impossible?" murmured the young man, going over to the window and leaning his forehead against the cold, mist-stained glass.
"You told me you had destroyed it."
"I was wrong. It has destroyed me."
"I don't believe it is my picture."
"Can't you see your ideal in it?"
Oh, I like that line, actually. I want to redo that.
"I don't believe this is my picture."
"Can't you see your ideal in it?" said Dorian bitterly.
"My ideal, as you call it."
"As you called it."
"There was nothing evil in it, nothing shameful. You were to me such an ideal as I shall never meet again."
"This is the face of a satyr. It is the face of my soul.
Christ! What a thing I have worshipped! It has the eyes of a devil."
"Each of us has heaven and hell in him, Basil," cried Dorian, with a wild gesture of despair. Hallward turned again to the portrait and gazed at it.
"My God! If it is true," he exclaimed, "and this is what you have done with your life, why, you must be worse even than those who talk against you fancy you to be."
He held the light up again to the canvas and examined it. The surface seemed to be quite undisturbed, and as he had left it, it was from within, apparently, that the foulness and horror had come. Through some strange quickening of inner life, the leprosies of sin were slowly eating the thing away. The rotting of a corpse in a watery grave was not so fearful. His hand shook, and the candle fell from its socket on the floor and lay sputtering. He placed a foot on it and put it out. Then he flung himself into the rickety chair that was standing by the table and buried his face in his hands.
Good God, Dorian. What a lesson. What an awful lesson.
There was no answer, but he could hear the young man sobbing at the window.
"Pray, Dorian, pray," he murmured. "What is it that one was taught to say in one's boyhood? Lead us not into temptation. Forgive us our sins. Wash away our iniquities. Let us say that together. The prayer of your pride has been answered. The prayer of your repentance will be answered Also, I worshipped you too much. I am punished for it. You worshipped yourself too much. We are both punished.
Dorian Gray turned slowly around and looked at him with tear-dimmed eyes. "It is too late, Basil," he faltered.
"It can never be too late, Dorian. Let us kneel down and try if we cannot remember a prayer. Isn't there a verse somewhere? Though your sins be as scarlet, yet I will make them as white as snow."
"Those words mean nothing to me now."
"Hush! Don't say that. You have done enough evil in your life. My God! Don't you see that accursed thing leering at us?"
Dorian Gray glanced at the picture, and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him, as though it had been suggested to him by the image on the canvas, whispered into his ear by those grinning lips. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him, and he loathed the man who was seated at the table more than in his whole life he had ever loathed anything. He glanced wildly around. Something glimmered on the top of the painted chest that faced him. His eye fell on it. He knew what it was. It was a knife that he had brought up some days before to cut a piece of cord and had forgotten to take away with him. He moved slowly towards it, passing Hallward as he did so. As soon as he got behind him, he seized it and turned round. Hallward stared in his chair as if he was going to rise. He rushed at him and dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down onto the table and stabbing again and again. There was a stifled groan and the horrible sound of someone choking with blood. 3 times the outstretched arms shot up convulsively, waving grotesque, stiff-fingered hands in the air. He stabbed him twice more, but the man did not move. Something began to trickle on the floor. He waited for a moment, still pressing the head down. Then he threw the knife on the table and listened. He could hear nothing but the drip, drip on the threadbare carpet. He opened the door and went out to the landing. The house was absolutely quiet. No one was about. For a few seconds he stood, bending over the balustrade, and peered down into the black seething well of darkness. Then he took out the key and returned to the room, locking himself in as he did so. The thing was still seated in the chair, straining over the table with bowed head and humped back, and long, fantastic arms. Had it not been for the red, jagged tear in the neck and the clotted black pool that was slowly widening on the table, one would have said that the man was simply asleep. How quickly it had all been done. He felt strangely calm, and walking over to the window, opened it and stepped out into the balcony. The wind had blown the fog away, and the sky was like a monstrous peacock's tail, starred with myriads of golden eyes. He looked down and saw the policeman going about his rounds and flashing the long beam of his lantern on the doors of the silent houses. The crimson spot of a prowling hansom gleamed at the corner and then vanished. A woman in a fluttering shawl was creeping slowly by the railings, staggering as she went. Now and then as she stopped and peered back, once she began to sing in a hoarse voice. The policeman strolled over and said something to her. She stumbled away, laughing. A bitter blast swept across the square. The gas lamps flickered and became blue, and the leafless trees shook their black iron branches to and fro. He shivered and went back, closing the window behind him. Having reached the door, he turned the key and opened it. He did not even glance at the murdered man. He felt that the secret of the whole thing was not to realize the situation. The friend who had painted the fatal portrait to which all his misery had been due had gone out of his life. That was enough. That was enough. Then he remembered the lamp. It was a rather curious one of Moorish workmanship, made of dull silver inlaid with arabesques of burnished steel and studded with coarse turquoises. Perhaps it might be missed by his servant, and questions would be asked. He hesitated for a moment, then he turned back and took it from the table. He could not help seeing the dead thing. How still it was. How horribly white and long the hands looked. It was like a dreadful wax image. Having locked the door behind him, he crept quietly downstairs. The woodwork creaked and seemed to cry out as if in pain. He stopped several times and waited. No, everything was still. It was merely the sound of his own footsteps. When he reached the library, he saw the bag and coat in the corner. They must be hidden away somewhere. He unlocked a secret press that was in the wainscoting, a press which he kept his own curious disguises, and put them into it. He could easily burn them afterwards. Then he pulled out his watch. It was 20 minutes to 2. He sat down and began to think. Every year, every month almost, men were strangled in England for what he had done. There had been a madness of murder in the air. Some red star had come too close to the earth. Sorry, just Dorian Gray's really into astrology, huh? Some red star had come too close to the earth. And yet, what evidence was there against him? Basil Hallward had left the house at 11. No one had seen him come in again. Most of the servants were at the Selby Royal. His valet had gone to bed. Paris. Yes, it was to Paris that Basil had gone, and by the midnight train as he had intended. With his curious, reserved habits, it would be months before any suspicions would be roused. Months. Everything could be destroyed long before then. A sudden thought struck him. He put on his fur coat and hat and went out into the hall. There he paused, hearing the slow, heavy tread of the policeman on the pavement outside, and seeing the flash of the bull's-eye reflecting in the window. He waited and held his breath. After a few moments, he drew back the latch and slipped out, shutting the door very gently behind him. Then he began ringing the bell. In about 5 minutes, his valet appeared, half-dressed, and looked very drowsy. "I'm sorry to have to wake you up, Francis," he said, stepping in, "but I had forgotten my latchkey. What time is it?" 10 minutes past 2, sir," answered the man, looking at the clock and blinking. 10 minutes past 2? How horribly late! You must wake me at 9 tomorrow. I have some work to do. All right, sir. Did anyone call this evening? Mr. Hallward, sir. He stayed till 11, and then he went away to catch his train. Ah. I'm sorry I didn't see him. Did he leave any message? No, sir, except that he would write you from Paris if he did not find you at the club. That will do, Francis. Don't forget to call me at 9 tomorrow. No, sir. The man shambled down the passage in his slippers. Dorian Gray threw his hat and coat upon the table and passed into the library. For a quarter of an hour he walked up and down the room, biting his lip and thinking. Then he took down the blue book from one of his shelves and began to turn over the leaves. Alan Campbell, 152 Hertford Street, Mayfair. Yes, that was the man he wanted. Whoa! Oh. So, like I've said before, I tried to read this when I was a kid, and judging by, actually I found a little dog ear in the middle of chapter, whatever it was, the exposition about various artifacts one. So I feel like I might have just gotten stuck in that chapter and never recovered. I remember skim reading it, and I vaguely remembered that there was a murder at some point, but I didn't remember that it was Basil. Oh no! Poor Basil. Shit. Oh. That was good. Alright, friends, I'm gonna leave it there. Anyone have any comments? I feel like I had something I wanted to say. I can't remember what it was. It was something I thought about halfway through. But then I got really caught up in the murder! Murder most foul! Oh, I liked Dorian's sinister turn. I liked doing his voice different. That was fun. Like, to still be, like, playboyish, but try and do it hard man. Hard man, little bitch. I enjoyed that. Poor Basil. Basil's insistence, and actually the whole idea of, like, beauty equals virtue was such a big thing. Yeah, what a wild ride, right? We went straight from talking about artifacts to having one of the main characters be murdered. Like, it's great. Whew. And now Basil is just left dripping and slowly rotting under the portrait of Dorian Gray. Alright. Thank you, my darlings. All the best to you. I hope that there is not too much of a drip, drip, drip in your house. But if there is, I guess it provided atmosphere. Bye!